It's good to see each one this evening. As we were singing the song just before the last one, Faith of Our Fathers, I couldn't help but think of an occasion when we sung that song in a hippodrome, as it was called, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, there near Tiberias. It was a place where a gleeful audience would sit and watch lions, various wild animals, tear Christians apart. You could see the cages where the animals were kept, and only imagine the horrors that would take place on the field in front of us. We sang that song, and you can imagine the effect. We're talked this morning about 1 Peter chapter 3, which speaks of our responsibility to be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks, a reason for the hope that is within you. Our faith is not an unreasonable faith. It's not one that is without defense. And it's our responsibility to be able to do that. And we're continuing that line of thought this evening, looking at the history of Israel as recorded in the Old Testament from her stones. That's a very broad subject, obviously. But as I mentioned this morning, I'm being somewhat selfish by focusing on those things where I have been personally involved, at least in some way, sometimes a very small way. But first, I want to again comment on the antagonistic environment surrounding the evidence that supports the Bible as you study archaeology in Israel. And we'll begin with a statement by Dr. Herzog, who's professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University, the largest university in Israel. This is what archaeologists have learned from the excavations in the land of Israel. Sounds like an interesting introductory statement, doesn't it? What would a professor at Tel Aviv University tell us we have learned? The Israelites were never in Egypt, did not conquer the land in a military campaign, and did not pass it on to the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, how did he learn that from archaeology? Of course, that's a stupid statement as far as archaeologists are concerned, in that you don't learn negatives from archaeology. You can establish a positive. This is confirmed by this discovery, but how do you learn that something didn't happen? You may discover evidence for it tomorrow. You don't prove negatives in archaeology, and that's something he knows. But this is a propaganda statement made to satisfy the Palestinians, and as we compare a statement like that with the statement, for example, by the late Yasser Arafat, former president of the Palestinian Authority, maybe we can get it into context. He says, "The notion of a Jewish origin in Jerusalem is a religious myth used to justify occupation and colonialism." Now, this is the Palestinian position, and if you find something that contradicts that, you're going to make them mad. The Israelis have buried lots of sons and daughters, and they don't want more war. So even if you find something really exciting, don't tell anybody about it. Keep it quiet, because we want peace. In addition to the opposition to spiritual truth that we know exists in the academic world, certainly here, we see much of it there. So all of that combines to provide a difficult context, though that's not the whole story. There are some very brave and courageous archaeologists in Israel who are doing a great job. And I want to introduce you to some of both categories this evening, beginning with just looking at the evidence. They can say tis and tain't back and forth, and that doesn't solve the issue. I want to begin with the altar of Joshua, which is probably something you hadn't heard a lot about. Doesn't get a lot of press, didn't, but I think it's a very significant find. It's on Mount Ebal. We mentioned briefly the amount of cursing, the amount of blessing this morning. Deuteronomy 27, we find the instructions given to Israel when they have crossed over the Jordan, they're given instructions. Set up stones, which I'm commanding you today on Mount Ebal, and you shall cover them with plaster. Now, they knew how to cut stones very well, but they were not to cut these stones. They were to cover them with plaster and then write the law in that plaster. Build an altar to the Lord. And then he says in verse 27, verse 11, that same day Moses charged the people as follows: when you've crossed over the Jordan, you shall stand on Mount Gerizim for the blessing. And that is, you read the law, and then the people who are from certain tribes will read blessings. Here's what's going to happen if you keep these laws. But then Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, Benjamin, those shall stand on Mount Ebal for the curse. All right, I've got that backwards, haven't I? All right, the ones who read the blessing are Simeon, Levi, Judah. The ones for the curse are Reuben, Gad. So you got half of the tribe reading the blessings, half of the Israelites reading the curse, which is a pretty good educational setup. You read the law, here's what's going to happen in either case. Here we're looking at a map, and you can see Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim right across from each other, Mount of blessing, Mount of cursing. And they had looked on Mount Ebal for the altar and had found nothing. They were looking up on top. That's not where it was exactly. Dr. Adam Zertal, who was chairman of the Department of Archeology at the University of Haifa, an atheist, trained as an atheist. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob were all like Mercury and Zeus and the various mythological characters of Greece and Roman mythology. This is what he was taught. This is what he was teaching. He was assigned the territory of Manasseh to do archaeological survey and just record meter by meter what was there. And in that process, he came on this strange-looking structure on Mount Ebal, about 2/3 of the way up the mountain. What in the world is this? Could this be the altar? Well, he didn't affirm that it was. He didn't believe that it was, but made that suggestion, which is all you have to do to get the ire of those who are opposing any biblical position. Lawrence Stagger, professor of archaeology of Israel at Harvard, responded saying, if a sacrificial altar stood on Mount Ebal, its impact on our research is revolutionary. All of us have to go back to kindergarten. Well, if you're teaching that Abraham is like Zeus, then yeah, it would require starting over, obviously. But what is this thing? He continued to excavate and see more details. Maybe it's a farmhouse, some suggested. Of course, it doesn't have any doors or any windows. It's not too good an explanation. Maybe it's a watchtower. Well, it's short and squatty. It's not on top of the mountain. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They really didn't have alternative explanations. One of the objections or questions that I had when I was looking at this is the distance between Ebal and Gerizim. Now, it's somewhat exaggerated in this wide-angle picture that I took, but I'm standing here beside the altar where perhaps Moses would have read the law. It would be written in the plaster on the side of the altar. And then those on Mount Gerizim would answer back, and those on Mount Ebal would read the curses. How do you hear each other back and forth? Pretty good PA system here. They didn't have that then. So we sent a crew across to Mount Gerizim. Dr. Dye, who was working with us, had a PhD in archaeology from UCLA, and 5 other PhDs, highly qualified creation scientist. Dr. Dye, can you hear us? Yeah, I can hear you. Just conversational tone, easy to just make chills go up and down your spine. Wow, this is an amphitheater, and you can just talk back and forth and hear as you would hear me right now, or better. Just, you had to be there to see that, to hear that. At least I had to, in order for it to be believable. As we continued to help excavate, we could see this complex around the altar, restored by Adam Zertal, to look more like this. The altar itself, of course, is the skeleton, what's left after the plaster has fallen off. He collected a good bit of it, by the way, or was in his basement. He passed away last October. But this is the innards of the altar, covered with plaster, probably looking something like this, as Dr. Zertal restored it. Exodus 20 gave instructions like this: you make an altar of stone for me, you shall not build it of cut stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you'll profane it. You shall not go up with steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it. Now, the Palestinians had lots of altars, and many times they had steps like this, but it wouldn't look like the Palestinian altars. They knew how to cut stones beautifully. You remember the stones at the temple were put together perfectly without the sound of a hammer at the site, but not these. This was made of uncut stones covered with plaster. Well, that all fits. As he excavated in the center of the altar, he began to find bones and ashes. Taking the bones and ashes to the Department of Zoology at Hebrew University, examining these, they found 942 bones in the center of this watchtower. No, don't think that's what it was. Turned out to be about 50 to 100 different individuals. Okay, what kind of individuals? We got bears, or maybe lions, eagles, snakes, the kind of things the Palestinians would have been offering. It was all sheep and goats and bulls. With some of the DNA examination, you could distinguish male, female, and determine age. Of the ones that could be determined, they were one-year-old males. I think we've got an altar of Israel here, and I think that's obviously established. They continued to look at the pottery, and it dated to the time of the Exodus with the thermoluminescent dating. And it was really exciting to be able to work there, at least for a short time, with Dr. Zertal and help uncover some of these things. He was publishing step by step the things that he found, and it was obvious his faith was growing. And by the time I got there, it was a very strong faith in God, in the Bible, and in Jesus Christ as the Messiah. He had become a devout Christian and had organized a group of Christians that were worshiping in the middle of Samaria, the Hamas territory. They had a small building and about 30 to 40 people worshiping with them. Some of the denominational people had offered to help. He said, no, I can't read about anything like that in the New Testament. I just want to be a Christian. And that's all they were. And it was an honor to work with him. As he continued to publish, he made this statement in one of his articles: what happened regarding the new accumulation of facts I have cited? Almost nothing. In other words, all of these objectors shut up. Since the appearance of the detailed reports in the many articles I have published on the excavation, silence has descended on the scholarly world. They just shut up. So I think we can say that it's time for Dr. Staggard to just go back to kindergarten and start over, because I think that establishes exactly what we read in the Bible. Let's go to Jericho, which we hear a lot about. Most of the children know the story. They were given instructions to conquer this walled city. You shall march around the city, all men of war, do so for 6 days. Seventh day, you march around 7 times, blow the trumpets, shout, and the walls fall down flat. And everybody will go up straight ahead. What kind of a battle plan does that sound like to you? Can you imagine Joshua explaining this to his army? We're going to march around and shout, and the walls will fall down. And I can just hear somebody saying, do you have a plan B? Obviously, if it happens like this, there's no question why the walls fell down. Well, a lot of people have excavated here. This is the modern city of Jericho, and in the background you can see the tell. This is the mound that supported or was under the ancient city. That is the type of thing that you find indicating ancient sites all over Israel. A lot of excavation has gone on, and back in the early 1900s, Garstang and others were certain this was Joshua's Jericho and that they had confirmed this story. You can see the results of the excavation throughout this tell. But then in the early 50s, Kathleen Kenyon arrived on the scene. We'll talk more about her later, but she is not a friend. She had a grandfather who was an excellent qualified archaeologist who did some important work, but she's of a different stripe. She came from Oxford as well as Cambridge and decided this was not biblical Jericho. It could not be. And the main reason she had was the absence of the Cypriot pottery. And she had a rather elaborate argument for that, which was not unreasonable. And it wasn't there. She dug, didn't find it, and so it couldn't be Joshua's Jericho. She did acknowledge that the ruins were blackened or reddened by fire. Most of the rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt, that they had fallen outward all the way around the city. But she just decided there's nothing here that indicates anything about what the Bible said. Bryant Wood arrived on the scene in about 2001 and 2. And we've worked with him at AI and some other sites. And he found and verified, documented in his monthly publication, Bible and Spade, the bricks falling outward just as described in Scripture. Piled up at the base of the embankment, and you can see some of these bricks still, the pieces that are left. But his diagram looked something like this that described what he found. The earthen tell with this mud brick wall and the upper wall built on top of it fell outward, and that fallen brick formed a ramp so that the Israelites could go straight up into the city. So that part of the story fit. But what about the Cypriot pottery? Well, she was digging in the poor part of the city, and that was the good stuff, the fine pottery, so to speak. And so when he dug in a better part of the city, he found all kinds of Cypriot pottery, went back and re-looked at and found out she had found it too. She just hadn't properly identified or had hidden it, which she has done on some other occasions. He also found a series of Egyptian scarabs, and by the way, we do have both some of the scarabs and some of the Cypriot pottery on display in the museum, and several of the artifacts we're looking at this evening you'll be able to see tonight. We have one of the better examples of this Cypriot pottery that he found that was her criteria for saying it's not Joshua's Jericho. Then when you find it, you use her criteria to prove that it is, obviously. And so we just whip them with their own stick, as we say in Arkansas. Perhaps the most impressive and exciting thing that I saw at Jericho was in an area that they didn't let tourists go to, but around on the north side of the tell, there was a portion of the wall that was still standing. And it had a house built into it. That's very interesting if you're familiar with the story. Joshua 2 says regarding Rahab, she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She helped the spies escape. And here the term house obviously refers to a physical building. 3 verses earlier, that same word is used when we read that Rahab asked, if he dealt kindly with you, you'll also deal kindly with my father's house. Now, that's sometimes family, but 80% of the time it means a physical building, and it did just 3 verses later. Sounds like that's including at least the physical building. Here is the only portion of the wall still standing, and it has a house built into it. I think I know who lived there. Another very exciting piece of evidence involves the Hebrew text, which we were dealing with this morning. This one is from 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a silver amulet. Now, we learned that papyrus doesn't hold up as well as the sheepskin, but silver does even better than that. It was found at St. Andrew's Scottish Presbyterian Church, or in the courtyard, or at least where that is today, obviously built on ancient ruins. And in the courtyard, we have a number of tombs, and here's one of the excavators laid out on the tomb as the body would have been. The tomb was over him, that has collapsed. And then underneath is a storage area where quite a bit of pottery and a number of artifacts were found, including that silver amulet. Gabriel Barke is one of the good guys in Israel who has defended courageously the opposition to what was found. And he very carefully and skillfully unrolled this silver amulet. It was rolled up after they had inscribed the message on it and worn around their necks. What in the world does this look like to you? I talked to the fellow who walked around with it for 2 weeks in his pocket, not having any idea what it was. Finally, they decided it was a silver amulet and that it needed to be unrolled. It took about 12 years to unroll it. It was a very difficult, delicate process. But when they did, they found out that, and a second one likewise was found the next year. But that first one says, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. Lift up his countenance, give you peace. This is the priestly blessing. And the text is just exactly like the one that we have. But, you know, when you copy and you copy, it deteriorates. Well, no. Even 400 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were 1,000 years older than the oldest that we had when the scrolls were found, is exactly like what we have now. This is from Jeremiah's time. How do you know you have what Jeremiah wrote? Well, we've got inscription from his time, text from his time, and it reads just like what we've got. I think that's exciting. How did they engrave that much writing on this small piece of silver? I think we get a clue from Jeremiah 17, where Jeremiah is speaking figuratively, but a figure that would refer to something they knew about. The sin of Judah is written down with an iron stylus with a diamond point. It is graved on the tablet of their heart. So they used iron stylus with a diamond point, and that's exactly the kind of thing would be required. In fact, on the back side of the large one, with infrared photography, about 5 years ago, they were able to determine most of the chapter is back there. And it's all perfect, at least in terms of its correspondence to today's text. 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Tel Dan is at the north end of Israel. You heard the expression from Dan to Beersheba. That's from the top end to the bottom end. There you see Mount Hermon in the background, and right at the base of Mount Hermon is the city of Dan. And it was there that the Tel Dan inscription was found. There are a number of other very exciting finds there that we don't have time to deal with, but this one is an inscription that wasn't written by the Israelites. It was written by King Hazael. And he's bragging about having killed 70 kings, including one from the house of David. Well, one of the phrases that we just hear constantly, even still today, but certainly up to this point, was, well, there's just no archaeological evidence anywhere for Saul, David, Solomon, the United Kingdom. That's just a myth. Maybe they were people that were exaggerated regarding the tales they told about it, but maybe David had 10, 12 men following him around. They lived in tents. That's all there was. Well, he's bragging about killing the kings, and one of them was from the house of David, according to Hazael, and this is the testimony of the enemy. One of the objections that we pointed out earlier, anytime you find something that you don't like, well, it's not providenced. It wasn't found by an excavation authorized by the Department of Antiquities. Well, the fellow that found this was the president or the director of the Department of Antiquities. So it doesn't get more providenced than that. That is certainly not an objection. And so when someone says there's no archaeological evidence for David, either they're ignorant or they're not telling the truth. And we find a lot of both. But summarizing then for the first part of the lesson this morning, just giving a general overview of some of the things that I particularly have had something to do with and then enjoy talking about. We have Joshua's altar on Mount Ebal, the fallen walls of Jericho, Rahab's house, the Hebrew text from Jeremiah's time, and the house of David inscription that is super providenced. But where I spent most of my time and was an area supervisor for a while was the city of David. And that's where we want to focus our attention for the rest of the presentation this evening. The house of David, the phrase might confuse some because sometimes it does have reference to Bethlehem. But usually in the Bible it has reference to Jerusalem. As here in 2 Samuel 5, King, that is David, and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. This was the last stronghold to be conquered by the soldiers there in Israel, all the way to David's time. They should have done it long before now, but now they're finally getting to this great stronghold where Jerusalem is. The inhabitants of the land said to David, "You'll not come in here. Blind the lame will turn you away," thinking David can't enter, but David nevertheless captured the stronghold of Zion, the city of David. Here obviously talking about Jerusalem. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. Okay, this is something we ought to find some kind of evidence for, but where is this greater and greater David there in Jerusalem? Well, what would be a problem with trying to find it there? Well, you remember the Babylonians? They came in and tore all this up. And then some of it was rebuilt, and then the Romans came and tore it up. And so if you were to find the palace there intact, then obviously this is not a true story. So it's a catch-22. You do or you don't. Either way, they have an objection. King Hiram, we're told in verse 11, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees, carpenters, stonemasons, and they built a house for David. Okay, cedar burns, we understand that, but it has to have foundations, and we ought to find some evidence of that. And so people began to look there and excavate in this city of David. And we see Kathleen Kenyon back in the picture. She was credited with modernizing archaeology in Israel, which means you eliminate the supernatural. In Jericho, as we indicated, from 52 to 58, and then went from there to the city of David. Here's her conclusion after she excavated in the city of David. It may seem disappointing, that the excavations have discovered none of the buildings of David's city. Virtually no remains, no area remains in which there's any hope of the finds of the period. It's just over, go home, no hope. The whole of this area must therefore be written off as far as any knowledge of early Jerusalem is concerned. There's just no way to know anything about the city of David, go home. Well, fortunately, they didn't, and Yigil-Shiloh took over after she left. He was a very brave and courageous man and refuted virtually all of the arguments that she made regarding some of the discoveries that she found. Excavated from 78 to 85, when unfortunately he died of cancer before his work could be published. Jane Cahill is now in the process of publishing that material, and she's doing that under opposition, but doing an excellent job. Taking over the dig after he passed away was Ronnie Raich and Ellie Sukron, who are the men who are now co-directors of the excavation of the city of David, and I've had the privilege of working with these men, and they are exposing the truth under fierce opposition. Introducing the opposition, Israel Finkelstein. We hear boos and hisses from Tel Aviv University, director of the Institute of Archeology. His comment goes like this: almost no signs of monumental building operations. The mythical united monarchy is a literary construct. Now, when you look at the way he's standing in that picture, you get a clue of where he's coming from, and that's all I'll say about that, but I think you understand what I'm talking about. He's not exactly objective in his philosophical views. Working with him is David Yushishkin, that we see in the center. He said, "I'm afraid that the evidence regarding the magnificent Solomonic capital was not discovered because it is non-existent." Now, again, if you're an archaeologist, you're trained, you don't prove negatives. Well, that's what he says is the reason it's non-existent, not because it's still hidden in the ground, which of course he can't possibly know. But that's his statement. These two men are saying it's not possible. Jane Cahill is responding, doing an excellent job while she is in the process of publishing Shiloh's work. She says, the most frequently voiced argument by those who challenge the historical existence of the united monarchy is a supposed lack of archaeological evidence. Now, there's more to that statement than would be apparent to the average listener. She's not just saying they hadn't found it. She's talking about that lack of positive evidence that we mentioned. The strongest evidence they've got is negative evidence, and that's no evidence in archaeology, is really what's being said here. But then proceeds saying, in most cases, these arguments are either grossly misleading, illogical, disingenuous, or all three, which is the way I would have said it, or maybe people from Texas don't say it quite that nice. They just say they're lying through their teeth. Or in Arkansas, they're lying through their tooth. But this is the way you say it when you're dignified and being nice. Grossly misleading, illogical, disingenuous. Well, we can call names, we can shout back and forth, but what is the real evidence for the city of David? It looks like this from an aerial view. It's an almost banana-shaped area. This is what David found as the city of David when he arrived. It was in that area. Restored to look something like this, and I think that's pretty close. You can see that there was a spring. Well, that's not quite obvious, but the water is coming out down at the bottom to irrigate the fields through the walls. That provided entrance, access for Joab to come in and open the doors from the inside through the water shaft, described in 2 Samuel 5. David said, whoever climbs up by the way of the water shaft defeats the Jebusites, the lame, the blind, who are hated by David. So he shall be chief and captain. Well, that's exactly what was done. And opened the doors, the army came rushing in, and the Jebusites were defeated. Another restoration shows it like this, and you can see the water here coming out through the water shafts. The pool of Siloam is down at the lower part that we'll look at again in a moment. But the water was coming from the Gihon spring. Now, these water shafts were not easy to walk in. They had rough bottoms. Well, they've kind of put concrete down there in the bottom where you can walk on them today, and you can just walk right on through there. And thousands of people are doing that all day long in the city of David today, saying, yep, this is exactly what it says, and it's easy to see how that could be done. This is my beloved here standing in the water shaft. The water was coming from the Gihon springs, and we read about that from 2 Chronicles 32. It was Hezekiah who stopped the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon. He saw Sennacherib coming, and he said, we're not going to let this happen again. That is what happened with David and Joab. We're going to not let Sennacherib do that, so we stop it up and we run the water in another direction. We'll show the diagram in a moment. The spring looks like this today, and to get to it, you have to come down through the Roman rubble and through the Babylonian rubble down to the level where it was in David's time. But it's still a very prolific spring, and you can see the natural area where it was eroded away with this great amount of water that is continually coming out. But look at the notch in the back here. That's not natural. That's what was carved by Hezekiah to redirect the water to the other side of the city. We can diagram it like this. The red section is the Gihon spring, and we can see that blue line was the tunnel where he redirected the water over to the pool of Siloam, and they began on either end and met in the middle, which was quite an engineering feat. Now, that's not as easy to walk in, and you have to wade in the water, but you can walk down Hezekiah's tunnel just almost as easily, and many people still do, and come out 1,700 feet down the way into the pool of Siloam, or what they thought was. The pool of Siloam, we showed for over 100 years, thinking that we'd found it. I don't think they had, and we've just recently found the real one. I'll elaborate on that in a minute. This is the picture that shows the Tower of Siloam that we initially thought were 4 towers guarding this water source. It's actually connected and more one tower. You remember in Luke 13, Jesus referred to the pool, or the Tower of Siloam, that surrounded the pool, and said there were 18 people that were killed there, reasoning with them about that and the lame man. Well, this is, of course, the thing that we found. We saw the walls, these huge stones that were guarded, that we've excavated, that surround that pool, where the 18 were killed when it fell. Actually, we found a 19th. Actually, that's my son who's clowning around. He found a donkey vertebra by the tower and decided it was the donkey that kicked the tower down. But we're having fun and enjoying finding these verifying facts. Hezekiah's tunnel was an engineering feat that was awesome and, of course, described in Scripture. Hezekiah stopped the waters of the Gihon, directed them to the west side of the city. He made the pool, the conduit, brought water into the city. And then you get down to the end of this tunnel, which should be approaching the pool of Siloam, and you find this hole in the wall, which raises all kinds of questions. What in the world is that about? Well, they've cut the inscription out that was there It's no longer there, but we know where it is. And you would never guess. It's in Istanbul, where quite a few of the artifacts from Israel were confiscated, and they'd like to have them back. They're not going to get them back anytime soon, but that's another story. You can see, though, the inscription that came from that wall, and this is a diagram of it, or a line drawing. You can see the translation, which describes the workers beginning at either end and amazingly getting closer and closer and hearing each other and shouting and finally meeting in the middle. And for the first time, the waters from the Gihon spring flowed right on down that tunnel to the pool of Siloam. Now, before we get to the pool, let's back up to the stairs, which were instrumental in leading us to some conclusions about the pool. The temple stairs are described in Nehemiah. He was repairing the stairs when he was rebuilding the temple. And these are the stairs, referring here to the wall of the pool of Siloam by the king's garden, under the stairs that go down from the city of David. This is the southern retaining wall of the temple. And you can see the people up there standing on the stairs that were just uncovered about 15 years ago by Abraham Mazar. And those stairs continued down. Now, the topography of the area is something like this. Here's the Temple Mount up here. It goes down pretty steeply down to the pool at the bottom, and there are stairs that go down that enable you to go from one end to the other. It's not an easy climb, but it's something that hundreds of people are doing now regularly. The stairs were the stairs that went into the temple, and no doubt the entrance that Jesus and his apostles used. Queen Helena, well, we don't have time to tell all about her. This is the mother of Constantine, about 300 AD, and she got her nose stuck in all of this and made all kind of messes. She built the wall that you can see over here in front of the gate that's up against the retaining wall. Why? What? Who knows? It's a wall, it's a building nobody knows about, but that's probably the gate beautiful that she halfway covered up. Why she would want to do that, I don't know. She claimed to be a Christian, but that's very likely the spot where Peter and John spoke to the lame man, where he jumped up and leapt, and then they drew the crowd. But you can stand here on these stairs, turning to the right. You see the pillar in the lower right-hand corner. That's that same pillar in the lower right-hand corner here, but now looking toward the Mount of Olives in the distance. And you remember the text saying they went a Sabbath day's journey from the temple to the Mount of Olives. How far is that? There it is. That's how far they could go. We turn again to the right and go down the stairs. Before we do, we sit at the bottom and we read some of those texts where Jesus and his disciples were teaching on these steps. The steps go down to the pool of Siloam. The text says, we were in the process of finding that. The pool of Siloam that we referred to is mentioned in John chapter 6, where Jesus, you remember, healed the blind man. He was to go wash in the pool of Siloam. Now, these pools were for the purpose of purifying, which was required before they could go to the temple. They had to wash in the pools, or they couldn't go to the temple. But the blind man had never been to the temple in his life. Why is that? Blind and the lame could not go. And why do you go to the pool of Siloam? So you can purify. Now then, you go to the pool of Siloam, you come up seeing. And for the first time in his life, he could go to the temple. A little bit more to the story as we understand the significance here. The little pool that you see here is what's at the end of that tunnel. What in the world is that about? It's not much of a pool. You couldn't purify thousands of people there. Lots of questions about that, but that's where the tunnel ended, and that's what was at the end of the tunnel, according to the text. We see the overall view, and the green arrow points to that little bitty pool that we thought might be the Pool of Siloam, and told many people. Eli Sucron was certain that wasn't the case, but that this large area covered by the trees, pointed to by the big green arrow, was the actual pool. And nobody would let him excavate there, could not get a permit. The arrow is pointing to a little road that goes across. This is owned by the Anglican Church, by the way, and they have fig trees and pomegranates there. The figs are wonderful, I'll have to admit, but it's not worth holding up the excavation. But under that road, there was a sewer pipe that broke. And so they decided they had to repair the sewer pipe, and Eli says, "You need some help?" And so he helped them excavate that sewer pipe, and sure enough, there is the big pool. It was found in 2004. This is one side of 4 sides of steps that go down to form about a 2-acre pool. This was later on that same year where more had been excavated. And then by 2005, we see more of it developing, and that's on 4 sides. And we've been excavating the daylights out of that sewer pipe ever since, without the permit, of course. This is probably the way the pool looked at the time of Christ. We've sunk some shafts and can get the dimensions. And so we hope to be able to finish that excavation soon. And we've had a great time. And of course, what's being excavated is the rubble and ruin from the destruction of Jerusalem that's washed down and filled up the pool. And here's Zenda here doing some of the sifting with Ronnie Raich, co-director of the dig, in 2006. And as we continue to look at this, of course, the question was, why did the tunnel end here and why is the pool over here? And the reason was that little bitty tunnel was just a way station, and that tunnel continued and went right on to the real Pool of Siloam. My son and Dr. Dye just emerged from that for the first time, perhaps in 2,000 years, dredging out that material, and the water is flowing all the way to the big pool at this point, looking like this in 2007. Now, one of the things that confused us as we were looking at this and we'd been searching for was, where are these steps that come down from the Temple Mount? We can see some steps as we look toward the west, straight ahead, but the escarpment over here is where, well, that's back toward the Temple Mount. Stairs? No, we got a big cliff here. The stairs stop at the edge of the pool. Nehemiah 3, he repaired the wall of the Pool of Siloam by the king's garden as far as the steps going down from the city of David. Well, we arrived and our Israeli general that we work with came running to us and said, "You need to come see this exciting discovery." It had just been uncovered. And it seems that one of the workers was reading the text. Okay, there's steps that go from the city of David that come down to the Pool of Siloam. And right up here where these wooden steps are put, he was standing looking, saying, this section of this wall, this cliff, is just a little bit too symmetrical. And so he took his sledgehammer and whammed it. And when he did, it collapsed. And there went the stairs right up through the escarpment, right up toward the Temple Mount, right where the text said it should be, which wouldn't have been found if he hadn't believed the text and looked for it. Josephus had described these steps and mentioned that the Jews were trying to escape the siege of Jerusalem in the tunnels that went under the steps. He says news had reached him, many of the Jews who had escaped from the siege of Jerusalem had collected there in the tunnels under the steps. Arriving at the spot, finding the information correct, the Roman commander broke down through these steps, and you can see the broken steps there. And underneath it is the tunnel into the streets in which they were hiding, 3,000 in all, and they perished to a man, according to Josephus. And we did find the skeletons there at the end of that tunnel. Actually, I'd found some of them the previous year and was told to cover them back up. That stopped the dig. This is an ancient cemetery. Just don't tell anybody. No, it's exactly what Josephus is describing here. When the Roman general broke through the steps, poured boiling oil down on 3,000 Jews. They were carrying pots, vessels, and we have some of those in the museum. Underneath is this tunnel, which is part of an elaborate, very complex and efficient drainage system. They had to have that to get rid of all the blood. I mean, there were thousands of animals being slaughtered. And if you know anything about slaughterhouses, if you don't take care of that blood, you're going to have a stinky mess. It was very effectively evacuated from the city through these sewage tunnels. Here you can see the tunnel underneath, the stairs on top. Elie Sucron described it this way. Many Jews tried to escape Jerusalem. When the Romans pursued them, they broke the flagstones, descending into the canals of the drainage system, hiding there for days at a time, as described by Josephus Flavius. We found cooking vessels, pots, remnants of food inside, stone vessels, other objects still preserved from the area. These vessels were used by the Jews who were hiding there until they were caught by the Roman soldiers, which you'll be able to see this evening. I think that was exciting. That was one of the most exciting and thrilling things, to step through that door and to see the stairs right where we'd been hunting for 4 years. Now, quickly, let's go back up the city of David, and in time, back up to where Kathleen Kenyon had excavated, back up where the era is. She worked at this step-stone structure, which is obviously something. She said, well, it was over hundreds of years, many different people. Shiloh has shown that no, it was exactly at the city at the time of David, and was all connected and interconnected so that you couldn't have one part without the other. It was built in the time of David. On the foot of it is an area that was built later. And one of the confusing things about archaeology in Jerusalem is you got at the same spot this level and this level and this level and this level in 1,000 years and 1,000 years, all in the same location. Well, here on the stepstone structure from David's time is this building that was built at the latter part of the first temple period, just as the Babylonians were approaching, or before, just before that. And it was an archive building. We see the arrow here pointing to particularly the area where documents were stored. And we know that because of the bully. Now, that's a term that refers to a clay impression. They would write a document, tie a string around it, put a glob of clay on the string, and then press their seal into that clay, leaving the impression, and it would dry. But then when the fire comes, that all burns up, except it fires the clay and preserves those bully, the impressions of the seal. We're looking here at some of the seals. You see the diagram of how that seal was used. The bully are the impressions. Yigil Shiloh was the one who excavated this building, the archive building, and found 51 bully, indicating number of important documents here. 26 of the 51 had biblical character names. It doesn't sound much like a fairy tale, does it? Now, some of the names, they could argue maybe it wasn't the character. Others had similar names, but when you got 26 out of 51, you got pretty good evidence that many of them were. And many of them were obviously acknowledged to be the biblical characters. For example, We read in 1 Chronicles 9 of Azariah, the son of Hilkiah. Okay, this is not just one name, but the son of Hilkiah. Here's his bully. This was a member of the family of high priest who officiated at the end of the first temple period, right? At the time where it's supposed to be. This is the official, yep, he would have had documents there. Then we find Jerahmeel, the king's son. All right, that's a person who would have had documents in the archive building. This is his bully. Then we find Gemariah, the son of Shaphan. He was, again, one of the officials in the court of Jehoiakim of Judah, who reigned in the first temple. These are characters that we can identify, especially as Jeremiah, the son of Shaphan. We know, I think, very reasonably where they were. And then we're looking here at a page from Biblical Archeology Review, announcing the discovery of a clay bully of the scribe of Jeremiah, Jeremiah's scribe confidant. Jeremiah 36:4, he called Baruch the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote a scroll at the dictation of Jeremiah. So he was a scribe. He was from a priestly family, and we found his bully. In fact, we found two of his bully in this building. One of them actually had his thumbprint in it. Archaeology of the Old Testament, not a conservative document, says this lump of clay was used to close a papyrus document sealed by none other than Baruch, the son of Neriah. Mentioned 26 times in the book of Jeremiah. This one shows his thumbprint in the clay. You know, tooth fairies don't have thumbprints. You know, these are real people, real characters that are documented. Now, that was found by Ugiel Shiloh, who was obviously refuting Kathleen Kenyon. But let's see if we can tie this together. I'll come back to some more very exciting evidence along that line before we conclude. But move to the announcement that was made in the New York Times 2005. King David's palace is found. This one of whom there's no archaeological evidence. Now then, New York Times admitting an Israeli archaeologist says she's uncovered in East Jerusalem what may be the fabled palace of King David. As we saw earlier, 2 Samuel 5, King Hiram of Tyre sent messengers to David with cedar trees, carpenters, built a house for David, which probably most of which burned up. But she found huge foundation stones beginning that palace that were on this stepped structure, which was the foundation for a very significant building. How did she do that? Well, several things were involved. One involved this Phoenician pillar that you see up at the top of the column that is of Phoenician style. Well, what's a Phoenician pillar doing in the middle of Jerusalem? Now, the Phoenician king built David's house, right? King of Tyre. And so that's to be expected. Well, why? The really significant thing is that Elat Mazar, described here as the finder, did not find that column. That had been found years earlier and hidden in a warehouse, and Elat Mazar found the notebooks describing it and went back and uncovered it from the storehouse. Kathleen Kenyon found it and didn't tell anybody about it and hid it in the back of her warehouse. But when Elat Mazar found it and realized what it belonged to, she said, this is where we need to dig. Plus, looking at the text of Scripture. She's pointing here to the area that we see with the red square where that palace was located, just below the Temple Mount. And here's the results of the excavation going downward. Now, I took the picture here looking down, and notice you go down this ladder and you go down that ladder and you go down this ladder. There's 6 levels here down to the bottom where you get to the obvious area where David's palace was. And here's some of the people who had gone with us to excavate, working side by side with some of the Bedouins, the Palestinians, the Jews. The fellow in the light blue shirt is not a Palestinian, but a cowboy hat, that's one of the elders from Dallas, but helping to excavate this very significant find. The pottery was from the 10th century. Some of it was very elaborate, like what you would find from a palace. Notice Alat Mazar's description of how this was found. She didn't mention here the pillar from Kathleen Kenyon, but she disclosed that to several of us. Archaeology is technical. You dig with the mind open to historical sources, and anything can help. I work with the Bible in one hand, the tools of excavation in the other. Try to consider everything. Now, her grandfather, who's shown in this picture, is the one who discovered the steps coming down from the Temple Mount. And now then she's following in his footsteps, professor there at Hebrew University. One of the main clues in finding David's palace, says Mazar, was surprisingly from the Bible itself. 2 Samuel 5:17 states David heard about it, went down from his palace to the citadel. All right, you know where the citadel is, you go up from where he came down, and that together with the pillar gave her the location. She published saying, this is where I think it is, this is where I'm going to dig. And then after publishing that, she dug and found it. And that's the way true scientists work. Now, shortly after that, she made two more important discoveries. Jeremiah 38 mentions Gedaliah and Jucal. These were two bad guys in the Old Testament who were opposing Jeremiah. Jeremiah was telling them, Babylon is coming. They're going to destroy us. They said, no, you can't talk like that. The officials said, let this man be put to death. Well, here were the two men who were saying that. And 50 yards from the archive building, we found the two bullae of these two men within a meter of each other. Jucal was found 2005, Gedaliah 2007. And of course we see several descriptions of that in these chapters. Verse 6 says they took Jeremiah, cast him into the cistern. They wouldn't allow him to put him to death. But these were the two men, the real two men, who put Jeremiah into the real pit, not a fairy tale. Now, if you think that's exciting, just hold on, it gets better. One of the most exciting finds was found in 2015, December, announced here in the Jerusalem Post, the bully of King Hezekiah. Now, this is the first time we found the bully of a king, the royal bully. And that was very exciting, and it was found again by Alat Mazar. Would you like to hear her description of the find? I'm going to play it for you anyway, so.
In archaeological excavations we conducted at the Ophel area, we found a most unique item, that is the private seal impression of King Hezekiah. This is the first time that such an item is found ever in archaeological excavations. This is so tiny, it's just 1 centimeter, and it was found during the wet sifting. It's a system that makes it possible for such an item to be revealed, otherwise it's so easily get lost. And we can see very easily the name of King Hezekiah, the symbol that he chose to put on his seal impression, means the sun disk with wings and symbol of life on both sides of the wings. And of course, this is a seal, private seal of the king, that most likely held by the king and by nobody else. And we found it. We found it in a royal quarter. That means that we get as close as possible, tangible as ever, to King Hezekiah himself. Of course, one of the most important figures in the Bible, King Hezekiah, known from Assyrian documents. Of course, he is well known from the Bible itself. And now we get to touch him as close as we can get by the archaeological evidence that was found in the excavations themselves conducted for many years at the Ophel site.
I think you can detect the emotion in her voice, which was appropriate. Finding Hezekiah's seal then, actually from the same spot within a meter, announced almost a year later, but after careful study and documentation, here we see announced this year in Biblical Archeology Review, the prophet Isaiah's bully. Now, part of it is broken, and some have said, well, we don't really know for sure because it just says Isaiah prophet. It doesn't say the prophet, but the part where the "the" would be is broken, and that's exactly what should be there. And it was found right next to Hezekiah, within a meter of Hezekiah's bully, right in this spot. And of course, in the Bible, Hezekiah, Isaiah are found in the same verse 15 times. And now then we find their bullies next to each other. Is that exciting or what? Thrilling. The bully evidence looks like this: 51 from the archive building by Yagil Shiloh, 26 with Bible names. Gemara, the scribe of King Jehoiakim, Jeremiel, the son of the king, Baruch, two of his, one with the thumbprint, scribe of Jeremiah, and then from the Ophel area, directly or near those steps that her grandfather found, Jucal and Gedaliah, Jeremiah's captors, and Hezekiah together with Isaiah. I think that's exciting. Summarizing, we've got Joshua's altar, the fallen walls, Rahab's house, the Hebrew text from Jeremiah's time, the House of David inscription, and then from the city of David, the water shaft, the Gihon Springs, the Tower of Siloam, Hezekiah's tunnel, the pool of Siloam, the stairs, the temple, huge. See, there's not much evidence. The administration or archive building, 51 bullet, 26 with Bible names, Jucal and Gedaliah and Hezekiah and Isaiah. And this is just a part of it. Literally, this is what we've had something to do with, which is why Jane Cahill says it's a supposed, it's not based on negative evidence admitting that there's nothing there. It's a supposed. If it were negative, it still wouldn't prove anything, but it's a supposed lack of evidence. In most cases, grossly misleading, illogical, disingenuous, or she knows what she's talking about. They're not telling the truth. The evidence from the history of Israel is absolutely overwhelming. And we have a good reason that we can give for our faith, both from the New Testament that we saw this morning, and now then from the Old Testament. We have a solid faith that we can defend. If you're here this evening and haven't confessed your faith in the Son of God, Jesus Christ, we encourage you to do that. If you don't know that evidence, let us show you. If you do, then have the courage to confess it, because it certainly doesn't lack evidence. If you've wandered away, we encourage you to come back while we stand together and sing.